He thought humiliating her would entertain the crowd, but he had no idea he was about to destroy his own legacy. The grand concert hall shimmered under golden chandeliers, the polished mahogany stage reflecting the soft glow of 1,000 lights as an audience of over 800 sat in hushed anticipation, their evening attire crisp, their expectations even sharper, because tonight belonged to Adrian Cross, a name that carried weight across every major city from New York to Los Angeles. A pianist whose performances routinely sold out within hours and whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by his quiet arrogance, the kind that lingered not in loud words but in the subtle curl of his lips when he glanced at anyone he deemed beneath him. And as he stepped onto the stage in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, the applause rose like a wave, filling the room with admiration that felt almost rehearsed, almost inevitable, because people didn't just come to hear Adrian Cross play, they came to witness perfection, or at least what they believed perfection looked like. Backstage, just beyond the heavy velvet curtains, Eleanor Hayes stood with a simple cleaning cloth in her hand, gently polishing the edge of a Steinway grand piano that cost more than most homes in the surrounding city, her reflection faintly visible in its glossy black surface. A woman in her early 40s wearing a modest gray cardigan and practical shoes, the kind of person no one noticed unless something went wrong. And that was exactly how the staff preferred it: invisible, efficient, silent, as if they were part of the building itself rather than people with stories, histories, and quiet dignity. And Eleanor had long ago learned to move that way, to exist without drawing attention, to let the world pass over her like a shadow drifting across the floor. From the stage, Adrian's voice carried back through the curtains as he greeted the audience, his tone smooth, confident, laced with a hint of theatrical charm that made people lean forward in their seats. And yet beneath that charm was something sharper, something colder, because Adrian Cross didn't just perform, he controlled the room, every pause, every note, every breath timed to perfection, and tonight was no different until, suddenly, something shifted, a subtle flicker of impatience, crossing his face as he adjusted his cufflinks and glanced toward the wings, as if the performance, despite all its grandeur, wasn't quite enough to satisfy him. The audience didn't notice it, not yet, but those backstage felt it immediately, the slight tension, the unspoken signal that Adrian was about to do something unpredictable, something that would remind everyone who truly held power in that room. And his eyes landed, almost lazily, on Eleanor, who had just finished polishing the piano and was stepping back, ready to disappear once again into the quiet corners of the hall. But before she could move, his voice cut through the space, casual, almost amused. "You there," he said, gesturing toward her with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Why don't you come out here for a moment?" And for a second, Eleanor froze, the cloth still in her hand, her heart skipping just enough to make her breath catch. Because moments like this never meant anything good, not for someone like her, not in a place like this, where status was everything and appearances were carefully curated. And yet the stage manager gave her a quick, uncertain nod, the kind that said there was no real choice. And so she stepped forward, her shoes soft against the polished floor, each step echoing louder in her ears than it did in the vast hall, until the curtain parted and the light hit her, bright and unforgiving, revealing her simple clothes, her calm but unreadable expression, and the faint murmur that rippled through the audience as they tried to understand why a cleaning woman was now standing beside one of the most celebrated pianists in the world. Adrian tilted his head slightly, studying her as if she were part of the evening's entertainment, something unscripted but amusing, and then he gestured toward the piano with a light, dismissive motion. "Go ahead," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "Let's see what you can do." And a few scattered chuckles rose from the audience, polite at first, then a little bolder as the implication settled in. Because to them, this was harmless, a small joke, a moment of levity before the real performance resumed, but Adrian's eyes remained fixed on Eleanor, waiting, measuring, already certain of the outcome, already confident that this brief interruption would only reinforce the difference between someone like him and someone like her. And for a heartbeat, Eleanor simply stood there, her gaze steady, her hands still, the noise of the room fading into a distant hum as something shifted behind her eyes, something quiet but unmistakable, And then, without a word, she stepped closer to the piano, placing the cloth gently on its edge as if returning it to its rightful place. And in that moment, the room didn't realize it yet, but the story they thought they were about to watch had already begun to change. For a moment, nothing happened, and that nothing stretched just long enough to make the audience shift in their seats, unsure whether this was part of the performance or an awkward interruption that had gone too far. Because Eleanor Hayes did not rush, she did not react the way they expected, she did not fumble or apologize or laugh nervously as someone in her position was supposed to do. Instead, she stood at the piano with a stillness that felt almost out of place under the bright stage lights, her fingers hovering just above the keys as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. And in the front rows, a few people exchanged glances, their polite smiles tightening, while further back someone let out a quiet chuckle that echoed just enough to ripple through the crowd, feeding the assumption that this was exactly what Adrian Cross had intended, a harmless spectacle, a reminder of the gap between mastery and mediocrity. Adrian himself stepped slightly to the side, folding his arms with casual confidence, his posture relaxed, his expression composed, but his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor with a subtle intensity, waiting for the inevitable hesitation, the mistake, the moment that would confirm everything he already believed. And when she did not immediately play, he tilted his head and added, just loud enough for the room to hear, "Take your time." The words wrapped in a tone that sounded generous but carried a faint edge of amusement, and a few more laughs followed, softer now, as if the audience was leaning into the joke rather than questioning it. Eleanor inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not draw attention but grounded her completely, and as her hands finally lowered onto the keys, the first notes that emerged were simple, almost tentative, a quiet sequence that drifted into the air without urgency, and for a brief moment it seemed to confirm every expectation in the room, because the melody was familiar, basic, the kind of piece a beginner might attempt after a few months of lessons, and Adrian's lips curved slightly, not into a full smile, but enough to suggest that the outcome was unfolding exactly as planned, and in the audience a few heads nodded subtly, their attention already beginning to fade as they prepared for the real performance to resume. But Eleanor did not stop, and that was the first detail that went unnoticed, because while the opening remained soft and unassuming, there was a precision in her timing that did not waver, a control in her touch that felt almost deliberate, and as the sequence continued, something shifted so gradually that it escaped immediate recognition, the tempo tightening just a fraction, the dynamics deepening, the notes gaining weight without losing clarity, and the room, though still filled with quiet murmurs, began to settle in a different way, not out of anticipation, but out of curiosity, because something about the way she played did not quite match the image they had already formed of her. Backstage, the stage manager leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing as he listened more closely, and even among the musicians waiting in the wings, there was a subtle change in posture, a collective stillness that replaced their earlier indifference, because they could hear it now, the underlying structure, the control beneath the simplicity, the kind of foundation that could not be faked, not even by someone trying their best to impress. Adrian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the faint amusement fading as his gaze sharpened, his attention no longer casual but focused, because the longer Eleanor continued, the more it became clear that she was not searching for the next note. She was choosing it, deliberately, confidently, and the difference between those two things was something he understood better than anyone. The melody evolved, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded immediate applause, but in a way that pulled the room inward, drawing the audience into a quieter kind of attention where the earlier laughter no longer fit, and one by one, the small distractions faded, the whispers died down, and a hush began to settle over the hall, not forced, not commanded, but earned, and in that growing silence, Eleanor's posture remained unchanged, her shoulders relaxed, her movements economical, as if she were no longer aware of the crowd or the lights or the man standing just a few feet away who had expected her to fail. And in that moment, something subtle but undeniable began to take shape, not yet a revelation, not yet the full truth, but the unmistakable sense that the story everyone thought they were watching was slipping quietly out of their control. The shift, when it finally came, did not announce itself with noise or spectacle, but with precision, the kind that quietly reshapes a room before anyone fully understands what is happening. Because Eleanor Hayes did not raise her head or change her posture, she did not seek attention or acknowledgement. She simply continued, and as her fingers moved across the keys, the simple melody she had begun with started to unravel into something far more intricate, the transitions tightening, the phrasing deepening, and the emotional weight behind each note becoming impossible to ignore. And somewhere in the middle rose a man who had been checking his phone slowly lowered it, his eyes lifting toward the stage with a faint crease forming between his brows, while a woman beside him leaned forward slightly, her earlier smile fading into something more focused, more attentive, as if she had just realized she was hearing something she could not easily explain. Adrian Cross felt it too, though he did not move at first, his arms still folded, his stance unchanged, but the confidence that had settled so comfortably around him moments earlier began to fracture in small, almost invisible ways, because what he was hearing no longer aligned with what he expected, and more importantly, it did not align with what he could dismiss, and his eyes narrowed just slightly, tracking Eleanor's hands as they moved with a fluidity that was not learned in a few casual lessons or picked up through observation. It was ingrained, practiced, refined over years, and that realization pressed quietly against his thoughts, unwelcome but undeniable. The melody shifted again, this time more boldly, weaving into a passage that demanded control, timing, and a level of technical awareness that most trained musicians struggled to achieve, and yet Eleanor moved through it without hesitation, her fingers gliding with a certainty that made each note feel intentional, grounded, inevitable, and the room responded in kind, the last traces of laughter dissolving into a silence that no longer felt polite or passive, but charged, expectant, as if the audience had collectively stepped into a different space without being told. Backstage, one of the younger pianists whispered under his breath, not quite believing what he was hearing, and the stage manager, who had been preparing to cue the next segment, slowly lowered his clipboard, his attention now fully captured by the performance unfolding in front of him. Because this was no longer a diversion, it was something else entirely, something that demanded to be witnessed. Eleanor's expression remained calm, her focus unwavering, but there was a subtle change in her presence, not outwardly dramatic, but deeply rooted, as if she had crossed an invisible line from being observed to being understood, and with that shift, the music expanded, the dynamics widening, the tempo accelerating with controlled intensity, and the piece began to reveal its true shape, no longer simple, no longer safe, but complex, layered, and undeniably powerful. Adrian took a small step forward without realizing it, his arms lowering slightly as his posture adjusted, drawn in despite himself, because what he was hearing now was not just competence, it was mastery, the kind that could not be improvised, the kind that spoke of a history he had not accounted for, and his mind moved quickly, searching for an explanation that would restore his sense of control, but none came. Only the steady progression of notes that continued to dismantle the assumptions he had made just minutes earlier. In the audience, the silence deepened, not a single cough or whisper breaking through, as if the entire hall had collectively agreed to hold its breath. And in that stillness, every detail became sharper, the resonance of each chord, the clarity of each transition, the emotion carried in the subtle variations of touch, and it was there, in that heightened awareness, that the realization began to settle, not all at once, but piece by piece, that the woman standing at the piano was not who they thought she was, and that whatever they had expected from this moment had already been left far behind, replaced by something far more compelling, far more unsettling, because it forced them to reconsider not just the performance, but the assumptions that had led them to underestimate her in the first place. And as Eleanor continued, her movement steady, her presence grounded, the room no longer belonged to Adrian Cross, not in the way it had before, because control had shifted, quietly but completely, and everyone in that hall could feel it, even if they could not yet put it into words. And somewhere in that silence, the truth was beginning to rise, undeniable and irreversible. And then it happened, the moment that separated imitation from mastery, because without warning, Eleanor shifted into a passage so demanding, so technically unforgiving, that even seasoned pianists in the audience felt a quiet tension rise in their chest, recognizing instantly what she had chosen to play, a composition known not just for its beauty, but for its relentless complexity, the kind that exposed even the smallest weakness in control or timing. And yet her hands did not hesitate. They did not falter. They moved with a speed and precision that transformed the air itself, each note landing exactly where it belonged, not rushed, not forced, but inevitable, as if the music had been waiting for her rather than the other way around. The sound expanded across the hall, filling every corner, rising and falling with a dynamic force that commanded attention, and the audience, now completely still, leaned into it without realizing they had done so, their earlier assumptions dissolving into something far more powerful: awe, the kind that silences thought and replaces it with pure presence, because what they were witnessing could no longer be explained by chance or effort alone. It was something deeper, something earned over years they had never seen. Adrian Cross stood motionless just a few feet away, his mind racing in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with realization. Because he knew this piece, he knew its structure, its traps, its demands, and he also knew how few people in the world could execute it the way Eleanor was doing now. Not just technically flawless, but emotionally precise. Every phrase shaped with intention, every transition seamless. And for the first time that evening, he was no longer observing. He was listening, truly listening, and what he heard unsettled him in a way he could not immediately process. The room held its breath as Eleanor moved into the most difficult section, a sequence that required absolute control, where even a fraction of hesitation would unravel the entire passage. And yet her fingers danced across the keys with a confidence that felt almost effortless, the kind that did not draw attention to itself because it did not need to. And somewhere in the front row, an older man who had spent decades in music education slowly shook his head in disbelief, whispering under his breath, as if confirming something only he understood, while beside him, a young student sat frozen, eyes wide, witnessing a level of artistry that would redefine everything she thought she knew about the instrument. Backstage, the quiet had deepened into something reverent. No one moving, no one speaking, because to interrupt even the smallest detail of what was happening would feel like breaking something fragile and rare, and the stage manager, who had once been concerned about timing and transitions, now stood completely still, his earlier urgency replaced by a quiet understanding that this moment was not part of the program, but it had become the only thing that mattered. Eleanor's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle intensity in her gaze now, not directed at the audience, not at Adrian, but inward, as if she were reconnecting with something long set aside, something that had never truly left her. And as the music built toward its climax, the energy in the room rose with it, not in noise, but in presence, a shared awareness that they were witnessing something they would remember long after the night ended. Adrian took another step forward, his usual composure slipping just enough to reveal the weight of what he was experiencing, because this was no longer about control or performance, it was about truth, and the truth unfolding in front of him was undeniable. The woman he had called onto the stage as a joke was not just capable, she was extraordinary, in a way that challenged everything he believed about talent, about status, about the quiet assumptions he had carried without question. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the final passage arrived, a cascade of notes that demanded both power and restraint, and Eleanor delivered it with a clarity that left no room for doubt, her hands slowing with deliberate grace as the last chord resonated through the hall, hanging in the air like a question no one was prepared to answer. And for a moment that stretched beyond time, no one moved, no one spoke, because the room had reached a place where sound itself felt unnecessary. And in that silence, heavier than any applause, the truth settled fully, unmistakably, and the world that had existed just minutes before no longer applied. The silence did not break immediately, and that was what made it powerful, because in a room filled with over 800 people, silence like that did not happen by accident. It was earned, and for several long seconds, no one moved. No one dared to disrupt the final note still lingering in the air, as if the entire hall had collectively forgotten how to react. And at the center of it all, Eleanor Hayes slowly lifted her hands from the keys, her fingers resting lightly above them for just a moment longer before she let them fall to her sides, her posture calm, her breathing steady, as if what she had just done required no acknowledgement at all. Adrian Cross stood frozen, the confidence that had once defined his presence now replaced by something far more fragile, uncertainty, not loud or dramatic, but deeply rooted, because everything he had assumed, everything he had relied on to define his place in that room, had just been quietly dismantled, not through confrontation, not through words, but through undeniable truth. And as he looked at Eleanor, really looked at her for the first time, he realized that the person standing beside him was not who he had decided she was, and that realization settled heavily, leaving him without the immediate response he was known for. In the front rows, a single pair of hands began to clap, hesitant at first, as if seeking permission, and then another joined, and another, until the sound grew, not into polite applause, but into something fuller, something that carried weight, recognition, respect, and it spread through the hall in a rising wave that filled the space once again. But this time it was different, because it was no longer directed at the man who had entered the stage as the evening's centerpiece. It was directed at the woman who had quietly taken it from him without ever asking for it. Eleanor did not bow immediately. She did not rush to acknowledge the applause. She simply stood there for a moment, allowing the sound to exist without responding to it. And then, with a small, composed nod, she stepped back from the piano, her movements as measured as they had been from the beginning, as if she were returning something that had never truly belonged to her in the first place. Adrian finally moved, taking a step closer, his voice, when it came, quieter than anyone in that room had ever heard it, stripped of its usual certainty. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a performance, but as a genuine question, and for a moment, Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes steady, unguarded, and in that brief exchange, there was no trace of resentment, no desire to prove anything further, only a quiet clarity that made the answer feel inevitable. "I never stopped," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him. And though the audience could not hear the words, they could see the shift, the subtle change in Adrian's expression as the meaning settled in, as the pieces began to align in a way that reframed everything that had just happened. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman stood, her voice breaking through the applause with a note of disbelief, calling out a name that had not been spoken in years. And as others turned, recognition began to spread, slow at first, then faster, as whispers moved through the rows, connecting memory to reality. And Adrian's eyes widened just slightly as he heard it, the name that carried history, reputation, legacy, and suddenly, the narrative he had constructed for the evening collapsed completely, replaced by a truth far greater than anything he had anticipated. Eleanor Hayes was not an unknown presence who had stepped into the light by chance. She was someone who had once commanded rooms just like this one, someone who had chosen silence over recognition, who had stepped away from a world that had defined her not by her humanity, but by her ability to perform, and in doing so, had become invisible to the very people who once admired her. The applause continued, stronger now, more certain, but Eleanor did not linger in it. She did not reclaim the spotlight or demand acknowledgement. She simply turned, stepping away from the piano, from the stage, from the attention, moving back toward the shadows where she had stood before, and as she disappeared behind the curtain, the room remained filled with sound, but also with something else, something quieter, something that settled into each person differently, because what they had witnessed was not just talent, it was a reminder, clear and undeniable, that dignity does not announce itself, it reveals itself, often in the moments when it is least expected. And that night, in a room built to celebrate excellence, everyone was left with the same unspoken realization that respect is not determined by appearance, but by truth. And truth, once revealed, does not need to raise its voice to be heard. The applause did not fade quickly. It lingered, rolling through the grand hall in waves that refused to settle, as if the audience itself was reluctant to let go of what they had just witnessed. And even as Eleanor Hayes disappeared behind the heavy velvet curtain, the energy she left behind remained, suspended in the air like an echo that could not be contained. And on the stage, Adrian Cross stood alone for the first time that evening, not as the center of attention, but as someone caught in the aftermath of a moment he had not controlled. And for a man who had built his entire career on precision and command, that realization settled heavily, forcing him into a stillness that felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Backstage, Eleanor moved quietly through the narrow corridor, the distant sound of applause following her, but not altering her pace. Her steps measured, her expression composed, as if the performance she had just delivered was not something to be celebrated, but simply something that had needed to be done. And as she reached the small service area where she had begun her evening, she picked up the same cloth she had set aside earlier, her fingers brushing over it briefly before she folded it neatly, returning it to its place with the same care she had shown the piano, as if the two actions belonged to the same world, connected not by status, but by intention. Behind her, the backstage door opened suddenly, the sound sharp against the quiet corridor, and Adrian stepped through, his presence no longer commanding in the way it had been under the lights, but searching, his eyes scanning until they found her, and for a moment he said nothing, as if the words he had relied on for so long no longer came as easily, because what stood before him was not the person he had expected to confront, but someone who had already moved beyond the need for explanation. "Why did you stop?" he finally asked, his voice lower, stripped of its earlier certainty, and Eleanor turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, thoughtful, as if the question itself carried a weight she had already considered long ago. "Because it was never about being seen," she replied, her tone calm, not defensive, not proud, simply honest, and Adrian felt something shift again, not in the room this time, but within himself, because the answer did not challenge him, it did not accuse him, it simply existed, and in doing so, it revealed how much he had misunderstood, not just her, but the very idea of what it meant to stand on that stage. In the hallway behind them, a few members of the orchestra had gathered, their voices low, their expressions still marked by what they had heard, and one of them stepped forward slightly, recognition clear in his eyes as he spoke her name again, more certain this time, and Adrian turned, following the sound, watching as the realization spread among them, not with excitement, but with respect, the kind that did not need to be announced. And for the first time that evening, he understood that the applause in the hall had not been the most important part of what had happened. It was this, the quiet acknowledgement of truth, the recognition that talent, real talent, did not demand attention, it revealed itself when it chose to. Eleanor gave a small nod, not to Adrian, not to the others, but to the moment itself, as if closing a chapter that had already been written, and then she turned back toward her work, her movements returning to the same quiet rhythm that had defined her before the stage lights ever touched her, and Adrian remained where he was, watching, not with judgment, not with superiority, but with a kind of awareness that felt new, as if something fundamental had shifted in the way he saw the world, and though the audience in the hall would leave that night with a story to tell, a moment to remember, the deeper impact would remain here, in the silence of a backstage corridor, where no spotlight reached, where no applause echoed, and where the truth had settled in its simplest form, undeniable and complete. That greatness does not need to announce itself, and dignity, once revealed, does not wait for permission to exist. The hallway did not return to normal after that moment, not immediately, because something intangible had shifted in the space, a quiet awareness that lingered between the people who had witnessed what unfolded. And even as Eleanor Hayes resumed her work with calm precision, wiping down a nearby surface with the same steady movements she had always used, those around her could no longer see her the same way. Because once truth reveals itself, it does not fade back into invisibility, it stays, altering perception in ways that cannot be undone. Adrian Cross remained standing where he was, his usual instinct to regain control held back by something unfamiliar, restraint. Because for the first time in a long while, he understood that this was not a situation he could redirect with charm or authority, and as he watched Eleanor move with quiet purpose, he realized that what had unsettled him most was not her ability, but the ease with which she carried it, without expectation, without performance, as if mastery was simply a part of who she was, not something she needed the world to validate. From the main hall, The muffled sound of applause began to taper into scattered conversations, the audience slowly returning to their seats, trying to process what they had experienced, and word spread quickly, moving from one row to another, from one group to the next. Her name repeated with growing certainty, Eleanor Hayes, a name that had once filled concert programs and critical reviews, now spoken with a mixture of disbelief and recognition, as people began connecting the past they had heard about with the present they had just witnessed. Backstage, one of the older orchestra members approached cautiously, his steps measured, as if unsure whether he was intruding on something private, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet respect, not the kind that seeks acknowledgement, but the kind that simply exists. "We thought you had retired," he said, and Eleanor paused for a brief moment, her hand resting lightly on the edge of a table, before she looked up, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded. "I stepped away," she replied, her tone neither regretful nor proud, just factual, as if the decision had never needed explanation. Adrian listened closely, each word settling deeper than he expected, because the narrative he had lived by, the one that equated visibility with value, suddenly felt incomplete, and as he looked at Eleanor again, he saw not someone who had lost something, but someone who had chosen something different, something that did not rely on applause or recognition to exist. A younger musician, unable to contain his curiosity, stepped forward slightly, his voice tentative but sincere. "Why come back tonight?" he asked. And for a moment, Eleanor did not answer, her gaze drifting briefly toward the direction of the stage, where the light still spilled faintly into the corridor, before returning to the present. "I did not come back," she said softly. "I was already here." And the simplicity of her response carried a weight that silenced further questions, because it revealed a truth that was easy to overlook, that presence is not defined by where you stand, but by how you exist within it. Adrian exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and in that moment, the need to reclaim the spotlight no longer felt important, because something more significant had taken its place. Understanding, not complete, not fully formed, but enough to shift the way he saw the world beyond that stage. And as the sounds from the hall began to call him back, the expectation of the audience waiting for him to continue, he hesitated, just for a second, before turning toward Eleanor once more, as if acknowledging, without words, that the balance had changed. Eleanor returned to her work, her movements steady, unaffected by the attention that still lingered around her, and as Adrian walked back toward the stage, the corridor behind him grew quieter, not empty, but settled, as if the moment that had unfolded there had found its place, not in noise, not in spectacle, but in the quiet understanding that remained. And when he stepped back into the light, the applause that greeted him felt different, not diminished, but reframed, because now, both he and the audience carried the same awareness, that what they had witnessed was not just a performance, but a reminder, one that would stay long after the music ended, that true excellence does not demand recognition, it reveals itself, and once seen, it changes everything. When Adrian Cross stepped back onto the stage, the light felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had, and as he approached the piano once more, the audience responded with applause that carried both admiration and curiosity, their earlier certainty replaced by something more complex, because they were no longer watching the same performance they had expected at the beginning of the night. They were watching what came after the truth had been revealed, and that subtle shift lingered in the air, shaping every movement, every note that would follow. Adrian paused for a brief moment beside the piano, his hand resting lightly on its polished surface, the same instrument that had just been transformed in the hands of someone he had underestimated. And for the first time in his career, he did not rush to begin. He allowed the silence to exist, not as a tool to control the room, but as a space to acknowledge what had already happened. And in that pause, the audience leaned in, not out of anticipation for brilliance, but out of respect for the moment itself. Backstage, Eleanor Hayes continued her quiet routine, her movements steady, unaffected by the growing recognition echoing through the hall, and yet those around her could not return to their previous indifference, their glances lingering just a moment longer, their postures subtly altered, because once someone has been seen for who they truly are, it becomes impossible to pretend otherwise. and even in the absence of applause, the respect remained, grounded and real. On stage, Adrian finally sat down, his posture composed, but no longer rigid, and as his fingers touched the keys, the first notes he played carried a different weight, not diminished, but more deliberate, as if each sound now held a deeper awareness, and the audience felt it immediately. The difference not in skill, but in intention, because this was no longer a performance driven by certainty, but one shaped by understanding. And as the melody unfolded, it carried a quiet acknowledgement, not spoken, but unmistakable, that the stage no longer belonged to him alone. In the front rows, those who had recognized Eleanor's name exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful, as if they were witnessing not just a continuation of the concert, but a response, a dialogue without words between two artists who had met in an unexpected way. And the realization settled among them that what had happened earlier was not an interruption, it was the defining moment of the evening, the point around which everything else now revolved. Adrian played with precision, with control, but also with something new, restraint, a willingness to let the music exist without forcing it into perfection. And as the piece developed, the audience listened differently, their attention no longer passive, but engaged, aware of the shift that had taken place. And in that shared awareness, the connection between performer and listener deepened, not through spectacle, but through authenticity. Backstage, a young stagehand approached Eleanor quietly, his voice respectful, almost hesitant. "That was incredible," he said, unsure if the words were enough. And Eleanor simply gave a small nod, her expression calm, not dismissive, but grounded, as if the moment did not belong to her alone, but to something larger, something that did not need to be claimed or explained. Adrian's performance continued, each note carrying a subtle echo of what had come before, not as imitation, but as influence, a reflection of the truth he had been forced to confront. And as the final notes of his piece approached, the room once again fell into silence, not the uncertain silence of earlier, but one filled with understanding, a shared recognition of the journey they had all just experienced. When the last chord faded, the applause returned, strong and genuine, but different from the beginning, because it was no longer rooted in expectation. It was earned through transformation, and as Adrian stood, acknowledging the audience with a measured bow, his gaze briefly shifted toward the wings, toward the place where Eleanor had disappeared, and though she was no longer visible, her presence remained, woven into the fabric of the evening in a way that could not be undone. And in that moment, as the lights continued to shine and the applause filled the hall, the lesson of the night settled quietly among them all, not announced, not emphasized, but understood, that greatness is not defined by who stands in the spotlight, but by the truth they reveal when they do. And sometimes, the most powerful performances are the ones no one expected to see. The night did not end when the final applause faded, because some moments do not conclude when the lights dim or when the audience leaves. They continue quietly, unfolding in the thoughts people carry with them. And as the grand concert hall slowly emptied, rows of seats returning to stillness one by one, the conversations that filled the aisles were different from the ones that had begun the evening, no longer centered on expectation or reputation, but on something far more personal, what they had witnessed, what they had felt, and what it had revealed about the way they had judged without knowing. Adrian Cross remained on the stage a moment longer than necessary, the echo of applause still lingering in his ears, but his attention no longer fixed on the crowd, instead drifting toward the empty space where Eleanor Hayes had once stood. And in that quiet reflection, the weight of the evening settled fully, not as a loss, but as a realization, the kind that reshapes not just a performance, but a perspective. And as he finally turned and walked toward the wings, his steps were slower, more deliberate, as if he were carrying something invisible but significant with him. Backstage, the corridor had returned to its usual rhythm, staff moving efficiently, voices low, the ordinary flow of work resuming as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And yet beneath that surface, there was a subtle difference, a quiet respect that lingered in the way people glanced toward Eleanor, no longer seeing her as part of the background, but as someone whose presence carried meaning beyond her role. And Eleanor herself remained unchanged, her movement steady, her focus grounded. as she completed her tasks with the same care she had always shown, as if the recognition did not alter who she was, but simply revealed what had always been there. Adrian approached her once more, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a quiet intention, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the authority that had once defined it, only sincerity. "I misjudged you," he said. The words simple, direct, and Eleanor paused briefly, meeting his gaze without tension, without hesitation, as if the statement did not surprise her, because it was something she had experienced many times before, not just from him, but from the world itself, and she gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement of a truth that needed no further explanation. "It happens," she replied softly, her tone neither critical nor forgiving, simply honest, and in that moment, Adrian understood that the lesson he had received was not something she needed to emphasize. It was something he needed to carry forward on his own. In the distance, the final guests exited the building, the heavy doors closing behind them with a quiet finality, and the grand hall, once filled with sound and attention, now stood empty, its silence no longer filled with expectation, but with memory, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. Eleanor finished her work, setting aside her cloth once more, and for a brief second, her gaze moved toward the stage, not with longing, not with regret, but with a quiet understanding, as if acknowledging a part of her life that remained present without needing to be reclaimed, and then she turned away, continuing forward with the same calm purpose that had defined her from the beginning. Adrian watched her go, not as someone above or below him, but as someone who had changed the way he saw the world. And as he stepped out of the building into the cool night air, the city lights stretching out before him, he carried with him a realization that no applause could match, that true greatness is not measured by recognition, but by the quiet certainty of who you are. And that night, in a place built to celebrate performance, the most powerful lesson had come not from the spotlight, but from the person who never needed it. And long after the music had faded, that truth remained, steady, undeniable, and impossible to ignore.